Welcome back to the Shared Practices Podcast. I'm your host today, George Hariri, and today we are wrapping up the Justin Short miniseries. It's funny calling it a miniseries because, when we originally talked about it and decided to do the whole miniseries, I don't think we thought it was going to be 12 episodes long, and I don't think we would have expected it to have as much content as it had. I mean, it was just about as big as the first season of this podcast. So anyway, we're wrapping up the Justin Short miniseries. And I really wanted to start today by talking about, just as much effort as Justin put into this whole thing. He just put in a ton of time. And, out of all the guests that I've had on the show, I don't think I've had one who's prepared for each episode as much effort as he put into each one. And then as many as we did. We did 12 or 11, and no, 12. We actually did 12. And he put in so much effort and time into each episode, and you can tell when you listen to it because it's just so polished, and he composes himself well. He shares a ton of great content, and so we were very lucky to have him on for the whole miniseries. And I can assure you that this is not the last you'll hear of Justin on this podcast. When I go through my acquisition, hopefully he'll be on talking to me about that on air, and then he'll also be at the Voices of Dentistry coming up in January, and so will I. I'm going to be speaking at the Voices of Dentistry about demographics and practice purchases, and I'm pretty excited about that. And then Justin will be there too. So if you want to meet Justin and go to the Voices of Dentistry, you can definitely do that and sign up. They're actually running a promo code right now, VOD200, and that'll save you $200 off the registration. And before we dive into the whole purpose of this episode, I just wanted to throw one last shout out to Justin. The lifestyle practice. I'll go ahead and leave a link in the description. Justin he has his website, The Lifestyle Practice, and his mailing list, and I'm on his email list, and we talk about it in his first episode on the show. But it's just a really, really good mailing list. He just shares very practical tips, and I think if you like the content that he has in his course, in this mini-series, you would really, really benefit from his email list. It's not annoying, and he just offers great value. So I'll put a link in the description. And then for anybody who, like myself, is wanting to use Justin as a coach, he normally has this kind of period where he's registering people. Normally if you're interested, you have to wait for his onboarding, and it helps him to do it all in bunches and batch that process. It makes it more efficient on his end. But he's agreed to let us, the listeners of the Shared Practices podcast, enroll when we're ready. Since we're buying practices, we can't necessarily time it around that. I actually had asked Justin, when does he recommend signing up and starting the coaching when you're buying a practice? And his advice for us pre-owners in the audience, the majority of us are pre-owners, was to sign up for the course, or his TLP Academy. And it's funny, he actually said if it was his son, he would make him do the course 10 times before buying a practice. And then after he's done the course over and over again and everything's ingrained, then he would buy the practice, or, whenever he bought the practice. And maybe a month in advance, so 1 to 2 months before he actually closed on the practice, he would actually start the coaching. And that's kind of what I'm planning on doing. Justin and I, we have a great relationship because of the podcast, but if I didn't have the podcast, that's exactly how I would do it. And, I think it's just great to go maybe right before the acquisition. Because that way you're able to get all of your, vision in place and everything that you want to do in a game plan moving forward. So that when you get in the practice, you can be consistent with the staff. And I think that would really allow us to hit the ground running. So back to today's episode. This is going to be a solo episode. And so I'm going to ask you guys on the Facebook group what you think about this. There's been a few times where I've thought it would be a good idea to do a solo episode. Just a few concepts where I feel like I could just tackle them by myself. But this one in particular, because I did the whole mini-series with Justin, I thought it'd be good if I just kind of wrapped it up with my thoughts, kind of like a giant outro. So that's what I had in mind for today's episode. And I think, it might seem a little random just because I have some notes here, and I asked you guys on the Facebook group what you thought, and I took some notes down. And so I'm just kind of going to go through it. But one of the things that really caught my eye when I started this miniseries was how much was in it. I don't think I expected it to have as much content as it did. And I really, really enjoyed it. And there was a lot of take-homes. And starting from the beginning, where we were talking about vision, I think it was one of the first episodes I had asked him, based on the practice that we were looking at buying and, the income and, knowing what we know about valuation and making changes and whatnot. It was funny because my wife and I, we sat down and we did the exercise in his course of, evaluating what we want our future income to be, how much we want to work, and all those types of things. And when we did that, what ended up happening is the amount of money that we would make from the practice, with some minor improvements, was pretty much where we want it to be. And it's not very motivating, to go into an opportunity and, not have to do a whole lot. And so I had asked him about that, and it kind of stumped him. But, throughout the whole course and through the mini series and talking to him, what he's really allowed me to do is set more ambitious goals. And, you think you may want something, but you actually want maybe a little bit more. And it's okay to want more, because with his philosophy and his style, more doesn't necessarily mean you're working more and sacrificing more. You're just being more intentional about what you're doing when you're there. And I think that's a thing that sticks out to me about the whole TLP and lifestyle practice. Richard talks about it in the first episode with Justin, was, the lifestyle practice was, it kind of sounds like a lifestyle company, laid back, think maybe Southern California, just relaxing. But in reality, it's like the exact opposite. I can't think of anybody that I've heard of who's more intense when they're at work than, Justin Short. He's not laid back at all. Everything he does is extremely intentional, but he's able to get these, extraordinary results where people, they don't really believe that he is able to accomplish that without any sort of crazy procedure mix or anything like that. And just to kind of recap for those who don't, maybe missed it, his practice, he worked 3 days a week. I think it was like 120 days a year. He took, I think, 8 or 12 weeks of vacation, and did about close to 1.7 million with about 50% overhead. I think that's about right. So, and, my whole review of that before we get into the specifics was I think his success came from his case acceptance, his efficiency, and then his case selection, scheduling, and leadership. I think if I had to narrow down why I felt he was able to achieve that kind of income in so little days, I would attribute it to those 5 things. And so I think one of those big takeaways, going back to it, was making a little bit more ambitious goals for myself and pushing myself to maybe achieve more in less days, or whatever it may be, whatever I really do want. And something came up where I think I was having a discussion with a listener, and the listener was asking me about multiple practices and whatnot. And then, I was thinking to myself, one of the big reasons why I'm so excited about working with Justin is because I think time with him will free up, his philosophies. He uses it, he invests in real estate and does other things. But, I think the perception is that, the days off, he's relaxing and enjoying time with his family. And, that's probably the case. But, I don't think that's necessarily the only way to apply his concepts. You can use that extra time to maybe be more entrepreneurial, have multiple practices, where your one practice may be the cash cow, producing, high income, and then you spend your time at your other locations, being more of an entrepreneur. That's one way to apply his philosophy. And so I think a lot of times it has the potential to be, I guess, misconceived as, working very little, making a lot of money, and that's the only way you can apply the Justin Short philosophies that we've talked about. And, I think kind of the same thing, it reminds me of Breakaway. If any of us familiar with Breakaway, the Scott Luna systems, they're very much associated with a PPO practice, because his very first practice in San Antonio was kind of a PPO practice that had low fees, and he had extraordinary success in that practice. And so everyone just assumed the Breakaway concepts were for PPO practices. And then, lo and behold, he opened up, I think, like 7 in Dallas, and eventually they became fee-for-service practices. So, I don't think any of these philosophies are specific to a specific type of practice, but I do think that his philosophy of being very efficient at the times that you're in the office to maximize income can be applied to different scenarios based on what your goals are. So I don't think he's a one-size-fits-all, where if you want to just, work very little and have a lot of time to yourself or your hobbies or whatever it may be, if that's not you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a good fit. And I think that's one thing that it came across to me, but maybe didn't to everybody. So I wanted to kind of get my take on that in this outro. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was his scheduling. I think we talked about his case acceptance, and I think the things I want to talk about is his efficiency, his case selection, and his scheduling. So his scheduling system, we went through it in a whole episode, and I kind of want to recap it a little bit. At the beginning of that episode, I talk about how, I like to do provider time scheduling, and that's something that I'm planning on doing, and we'll see how it goes when I do it. Maybe I'll switch, but that's where I'm going to start. And he does more of a scheduling to goal. So he'll fill his schedule up to a specific goal. I believe his was $12,500, and then he increased it to $13,000 towards the end of his career. Well, now he's, as you probably know, he's sold his practice. So at $13,000 is where he ended. And the difference between his scheduling system, scheduling to goal, versus a provider time scheduling doesn't really take into account the fees of a particular procedure. It's more attempting to maximize the efficiency of the provider's time versus Justin's scheduling system. Let's just say on a specific day, he's filled it up to $13,000. Instead of putting an extra procedure that day where he may have an open time slot, they'll move that procedure to another day that does not have the $13,000 that is their goal. That way, in his mind, when he works so many days per year, because he's evenly allocating his production across those days, he can then predictably know how much he's going to produce in a given year. And so that's the benefit of his system, is the predictability that comes with it. And, another thing that I think is important on that same note, let's just say a day is full in terms of its production value, but it's not full in terms of time. That opens up his ability to see those non-productive cases, denture adjustments, whatever it may be, those appointments that are not necessarily resulting in income, but are necessary for the, keeping the practice going. Those appointments fit in nicely. So his scheduling to goal does a couple things. It evens out the production across, many days, and it leads to a predictable amount. So every day he goes in, assuming he has sufficient demand, which comes back to his case acceptance and his marketing, then he would know that he's going to produce at least $13,000 that day. So I think that's pretty unique. It's not necessarily unique as a PDA concept, but it's pretty reliable and predictable for him to take so many days off, knowing that he'll have a specific production at the end of the year, given the fact that he schedules by goal. And the other thing is, we talked about in the episode, was efficiency, where, I kind of told him, Justin, just by scheduling by goal doesn't necessarily mean everybody can have a $13,000 day. And he said that's essentially a good point, because you have to be, fast enough to, have your appointments be short enough so that you can fit that kind of production in a given day. And a lot of people have asked for a particular picture of a schedule or whatnot. If you are on Justin's email list and he sends an email, you can reply to any of those emails. And he said on our Facebook group that if you reply to one of those emails asking for a schedule, then he'll be able to shoot one your way, and then you can take a look at it and see what it looks like. Another question that came up quite a bit was his procedure mix. So, $13,000 a day for a lot of people, including myself, doesn't really seem like it's that plausible every day without a crazy procedure mix. But Justin, he's a PPO practice, PPO fees, and he does bread and butter dentistry. He does lower molar endo. He places about 2 implants a month, and then he does some basic aligner orthodontics. So in terms of the procedure mix, I think most people in the audience, a couple years out of school, that's pretty much their procedure mix. I don't think that's anything, substantial. But in talking to him, one thing that I kind of figured out was that's his procedure mix by choice. I think his scope of practice and his clinical skill may allow him to do more procedures, but it comes down to efficiency in everything that he does. And, he does 2 implants a month, not because he can't handle more, it's because he cannot handle more efficiently. So if he's looking at an endo and it's going to take him a specific amount of time, he would rather send that out than do it himself, because, his time is very valuable in the way that he schedules and the amount of time that he's there and his production goals. He doesn't have 2 hours to spend on a molar um, you know, for $600 or whatever the reimbursement may be. So I think one thing I learned from him is his efficiency has a lot to do with his case selection and the kinds of procedures that he keeps and the kind of procedures he refers. And so that's something to keep in mind too, is when you're, just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. Not only from the patient's perspective, but also from a financial perspective, it may not make sense. It may be dragging down your production instead of increasing it. And that's assuming that you would have something else to do in that place. The other thing that, I think was pretty remarkable, to me at least, was the low overhead. Around 50%, given that kind of production, you normally expect overhead to be a little bit higher. And, he did only have 5 ops, if I was correct in that. And so, you do kind of dilute your fixed costs of the facility and whatnot, having such a large amount of production. But really, I think it's his staff. When you look at overhead, the biggest overhead expense is your staff overhead. And, Justin, he kept it around 20% was the number he was talking about. And, we had a discussion about, how, you'll see those percentages vary. And he ran through his percentages for us. But really, the 20% for staff was kind of one that, I heard it, and that's lower than I really ever hear it before. And I think if there's one position in the office that Justin is, I guess, lean and mean on, it would be the front desk. I think from talking to him, he did 1.7, and he had one front desk member, and they were there. So he was there 3 days a week, and his staff was there 4. And I think just from the purpose of keeping staff, he kind of, he felt maybe like he had to have more, full-time hours for them. But then also that time that he wasn't there, they were preparing for, the times that he was there. They were filling a schedule, getting everything ready, getting everything organized so that when he was in the office, they were worried about seeing patients and producing, reaching their goals. And then when he was not in the office that day, they had to catch up on the other things that would normally be done that may slow them down during those productive days. And so back to the front desk, I think most offices have, at that kind of production level, have 2 front desks. And I think the fact that he was able to do it in one has a lot to do with his low overhead, but I think it has something to say about his leadership. And I don't think, for a long time he had one assistant, and I'll talk about that in a second, but let's just say you have one assistant, one hygienist, one front desk, and you're doing 1.3 million, your overhead is going to be really low. And so how is he able to achieve that kind of production with, and every time I say production, I mean, adjustable production. This is fees that he'll actually collect, not like gross production that's inflated and then will be adjusted with insurance. But how is he able to produce 1.3 million with a low staff? And I think it has to do with his leadership, where, he's able to handle things with his staff and have them be trained well enough. He calls it the team of 10s, where, one staff member is able to handle the job, maybe 1.5 in an office with maybe more poorly trained staff, not as much leadership, not as tight of systems. And so he's able to pay his staff really well. Actually, he went through how much he pays each of his team members. And, for their area, they're probably the highest paid, but they're probably also the hardest working. And they may do the job of 1.5 to 2 team members because they're so, well motivated, highly paid, and highly motivated with great leadership. And one of the things that actually stuck out to me was, well, let me just go back to the front desk thing real quick. When talking about the front desk, he, talked about one front desk member. And this, to me, it kind of, in the office I'm looking at, there's an office manager and then there's a front desk member. And from talking to the seller, the office manager, they're kind of going to retire with the seller, potentially. I don't know if that's going to happen for sure, but that's kind of what I'm hearing. And so from my perspective, before I had started talking to Justin and did the whole mini-series, I always thought I would eventually replace them. But talking to Justin, I think that definitely changed my perspective. If there's one thing that, I'll do differently for sure, is probably try out that one front desk for a while and see what happens. And, I was thinking maybe if it got too bad, I could outsource some sort of insurance or, new patient phone calls or something like that to ease the burden on the front desk. And it was funny because somebody had mentioned that same thing on the the Facebook group, and Justin responded saying that, you can outsource those front desk duties, but ultimately, are you outsourcing them because you actually really need to outsource them, or are you outsourcing them because it's just easier and the front desk is not going to come, no employee is going to complain about having less to do. And so I think that goes back to his leadership where, he really held his staff accountable for, a lot of functions and a lot of duties. And, he held the bar really high and put them up to that kind of standard and expected them to deliver. And so I was very impressed with, that expectation of them and the fact that they were able to do it through his leadership and, his staff management skills. And, one thing that stuck out to me was the way he interacted with staff, and really this was kind of a theme throughout the whole thing. We call it front loading the process. Towards the beginning of the mini-series, we talked about front loading the process. And really that's any time you see an issue that will be a bigger issue down the road, you nip it in the butt as fast as possible. And so, it came up with staff, but then also it comes up with, when do you implement all these systems in your practice? The earlier you do it, the more you front load that process, the more you get to enjoy it later. And so, it's very interesting because a lot of different things like with staff, anytime they do something that he didn't like, right there, you pull them aside, talk to them about it, and then you move on. I made the joke, I failed at making the joke, you keep it short, but he kept everything short with them. And, they got the point, but he was very intentional about doing it quickly. And then the other thing, he talks about training your staff to diagnose and co-diagnose with you. Look at x-rays and, diagnose. And I asked him, like, when are you doing this? Are you having a meeting? Or he's like, no, kind of all the time. Just at any given moment, you're always, showing them x-rays, talking to them about it. And it's that idea that, you don't have to have a formal training session or, a meeting to do these things. You can kind of do it all the time throughout the day, as it comes up. So both training staff, to diagnose with you and, think how you think and customer service skills and all those things, they can be done all the time throughout the day. And then the other thing that he said in that same light was reflecting on your experiences. And that really stuck out to me because, he would go in, present treatment, and then he would walk out and take a second and think, how did that go? And I think that's much more effective is, doing a lot of small things all the time to have a big result instead of, having a big meeting once a month and going over all these things. So I got that mindset from him. It's kind of a common theme I saw, both front loading that process, and anytime you see an issue that needs to be addressed, you address it right away because at some point it's going to have to be addressed anyway. And so the biggest benefit is to do it as soon as possible. And the second thing was, doing all of those little things all the time. Anything that you feel like you could do to improve your practice, you just constantly doing it, and then your practice will improve, as opposed to, trying to do it in a more, like trying to reflect on your experiences at the end of the day versus reflecting on your experiences throughout the whole day. So I think it's just a much more effective way to improve and to have those, have the improvement in your practice at a more consistent basis, doing it all the time. And I think I'll wrap up staff with the making decisions with his team quickly. I think he talked about a hygienist that he had that wasn't necessarily a good fit, and as opposed to, he could have left her on for a little bit until he found somebody else. But it goes back to front loading the process and just, it's not a good fit. She's not a long-term solution to my issue, so I'm not going to let it go on any longer. And then he, terminated her immediately. And, he said nothing against her. She's a great hygienist, but she just wasn't a fit for his practice. And that was a theme he kept going back to. It wasn't a fit for my practice. And, I give him a lot of credit for having the ability to have that vision in mind and keep it always in the forefront of his mind when he's making decisions. So if something's happening, he can make that difficult decision quickly, move on, and then try to find somebody who's a long-term fit for him. So I think in terms of his scheduling and his staff and his overhead, I think those were the three things that I think really stuck out to me and his leadership skills. And those were specific things that I had talked about in that I think led to those great results that he had, where you kind of look at his practice, like how is he really able to achieve that? And then I think when you listen to the whole mini series and you break it down, it starts to make a little bit more sense. And the last thing I want to talk about is maybe some things I disagreed with him on. I think, and the thing I really like about him is the fact that it's okay to disagree with him, because, ultimately everybody's different. And, I was kind of impressed with how okay he was with me not being on board with some of the things he does. And I think I'll have a couple in mind. I talk about this in the metrics episode, overhead and metrics. I think if you guys listen to this podcast enough, you know that I don't want to say metrics junkie, but I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to metrics. They mean a lot to me, and I like to use them, and I get information from them. And, he makes a good point in that episode. We were talking about it, and he talked about how, the metrics are great if you're acting on them, but he finds a lot of the times people are just staring at their metrics and watching them, but not really doing anything to change them. So, we'll see how I end up handling them, but, I hope that I'll be acting on them. And I'm a big fan of the metrics, and so that was a part of the miniseries where I felt like we maybe disagreed a little bit. And the other one was scheduling. So, Justin, I'll kind of contrast his scheduling versus, more of traditional provider time scheduling. So Justin, it was funny because we were talking about it, and he says, I really do use provider time scheduling. I just don't use the provider time scheduling format. But essentially so let me just go back. For those of you who don't know what provider time scheduling is, it's not necessarily a breakaway concept, but they're the ones who made it very well known, where you stagger your schedule in accordance to where you expect to be, so that you're never at the same place you're never at two different places at the same time. So you'll have, let's just say you're doing a crown, your patient will come in, their assistant will see the patient and get everything ready up to the point where you're needed. And then you come in, you do all the things that are needed without having to leave for another patient other than hygiene. And then you leave the room and you'll have another patient waiting for you that has already been prepared by the assistant. So it's this way of scheduling to maximize the dentist's time so that they're only seeing one patient at a time for a restorative procedure, but they are seeing them quicker because they're condensing that appointment, because they're not jumping around between chairs. And it's supposed to lower stress and increase your efficiency. So Justin, he schedules by goal, and provider time scheduling is it's meant to make the provider time as efficient as possible, and doesn't really take into account the monetary value per each procedure. So what ends up happening with provider time scheduling is you may have some days where your time is being used very efficiently for, low production procedures. So you may be very efficient, but you didn't produce a whole lot. And so Justin's scheduling to goal is his way of ensuring that doesn't happen, but he's not taking into account his provider time. He's taking into account the monetary value of each day. And so that will lead to those less spikes that you may have with the provider time scheduling. But it may have inefficiencies within his provider time. And then his solution to that is to squeeze in those inefficient or non-profitable procedures that he doesn't want to put in on a day where he has not reached a goal yet. And, Justin was telling me that, he builds his schedule based on, how much things take him, how much time things take him. And so I think everybody to an extent does in their mind provider time scheduling, where they'll stagger appointments slightly to make it so that they're not wasting time. But ultimately, they, to do true provider time scheduling, that's not the core of what he does. I think he does more of a hybrid between provider time scheduling and a PDA scheduling to goal. And we want to talk about the one assistant a little bit. On our Facebook group, it was a bit of a discussion. And, Justin, for a long time, he had one assistant. And I think for the provider time scheduling to work, or, maybe his staggering, in order for the doctor to be as efficient as possible, they really need at least two assistants. I think more than two would be a little, have to be very high producing. So, Justin said that for a long time he had one, and what you'd end up doing is you'd end up bringing a patient back or setting up a room or doing some assistant functions at any given time, while the other assistant is working. One assistant was not enough to make sure you were always doing, dentist functions. And so, but he wanted to make sure that in order for him to bring on that second assistant, he had to make sure that he was as efficient as possible. And, I think that's just a general theme of whenever he's going to expand his capacity by bringing on some additional fixed costs like another staff member, he's going to make sure they're really, really needed. And so he said he tried it out for a few months just to make sure that he absolutely needed that assistant before he brought her on. So that's Justin's take on it. I think for me, I'll try the one front desk, and I think that'll be effective, especially in terms of overhead. I think I'll go with 2 assistants, maybe a little bit faster than he did. That's just my own personal take. If I'm a little bit less profitable, so be it. I think that two assistants for the type of scheduling I want to do is a necessity. Depending on what you're doing in your practice model, whatnot, that may vary. But that was my take on the assistant that he had talked about before. And then the other one was the daily goal and the bonuses. I had kind of already talked about how the provider time scheduling does not really allow for a daily goal. But then also the bonuses. We didn't really talk about bonuses in the miniseries. And if you're upset about that, blame me. That was part of Justin's course. And when I was taking his course, I kind of talked about how I didn't think it was something that I thought maybe boded well to the podcast format, where, you guys are in your car driving around. I didn't think the bonus, it's kind of nitty gritty numbers of, how he pays his staff and whatnot. I'm sure if you ask him about it, or, obviously if you take his course, there's a whole, a lot of content on the bonus structure. But I think the gist of it is, his staff is highly compensated, and they, they do well because of their bonus structure. I've always been a little bit hesitant about the bonuses. I think I want to try it without it first. I think it's one thing that when you give it, you can't really take it back. That's my personal take on the bonuses. And so I want to try without them and see what happens. But I'm open to, adding them if it feel like it's needed, or if I feel like it'll benefit everybody in the end. And the last thing I want to talk about was real estate, since that was the last thing we talked about in the miniseries. I think Justin, it's just very impressive, the type of financial independence he was able to obtain. And I think it's something that we kind of all strive for, to some degree, the feeling of being financially independent or free, however you may define that, whether it means no debt to you or whether it means passive income, whatever it may be. But a few of the takeaways that I took, I'm a big real estate guy in terms of, it's an interest of mine. I don't have any real estate at the time, but, I think Justin, what made him successful in real estate in the St. Louis market was knowing a few areas very well, where he was able to buy deals below market value because he understood what market value was on almost an internal, inherent level of how well he understood his few zip codes. So if I was, to take the advice in that whole episode and apply it to my life, I would look at the type of real estate I want to invest in. In my case, maybe it's multifamily real estate, and I would look at the demographics. I don't think I could get through a whole podcast without talking about demographics, especially if I don't have someone with me. So I'm going to talk about demographics. If you look at multifamily property, who is living in a multifamily, residences, and see where they are, and see where, the most dense population of multifamily residents are, and then look at, what are the rental rates compared to the, maybe the, the class of tenant you have, whatever your comfort level is, find out where your opportunities are going to be, and then get to know those areas very, very well. And the benefit of that is, from a financial perspective, Justin's able to buy a property, 20% below market value. And from a financial perspective, if you buy something 20% below market value, you're essentially, by the time you make your down payment, let's say you put 20% down, and then you bought it 20% below market value, you're left with about 36% equity, if you're going to sell it for market value. So what that means is buying it 20% off and putting 20% down, like he does, it's the equivalent to putting 36% down on a properly priced property. So he's getting a free, 16% of his equity pretty much, completely free. because of the way that he does his deals. So what that allows him to do is it takes a lot of the risk out of the transaction, because if he needs to recuperate his investment, he can just sell it for a small profit after the fees of paying all the brokers and whatnot, because he bought it at a great price. And that goes back to the real estate concept, that you really win the deal when you buy it versus, when you sell or whatever will happen with the property. You really judge the value of an investment based on current conditions and not, predicting future conditions, because those are unpredictable. And I think that kind of covers what I had in mind for this episode. It was a bit weird for me. I've been talking now for quite a while, and it's a bit weird for me to do that. So I hope you guys liked it. And, it was such a great mini-series, and I just can't thank Justin enough. So, go on our Facebook group, thank Justin for what he did and what he contributed to the Shared Practices podcast. And then next week, we'll pick up the season. We'll have a season 1 throwback, and then we'll jump back right back into season 2. So we have, Tanner Applegate coming in for season 2, and then we have Jake Stimmel next week talking about his experience as a headhunter, looking for associates. So we got some great stuff coming. Season 2 will probably end around March, so we still got some great stuff going, and it's definitely been fun so far. I appreciate Justin for the mini-series, and we look forward to seeing you guys on the Facebook group and hearing you next week on the Shared Practices podcast. Thank you.